So I'm going to go ahead and start this a little bit early, just because I feel like I got trolled, or I'm pretty sure that I just got trolled, because just said that they couldn't hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and start this stream a little bit early. And when I replayed that stream, I could hear it perfectly fine. That person was complaining that they couldn't hear it, but after I killed the stream and I went and I rewatched it, I could hear myself just fine. So I think I got trolled, and if anyone else here posts and tells me that you can hear me just fine, then if I see that guy posting on this channel again, I'm just going to ban him, because I'm pretty sure he just trolled me. So I hope it was fun, loser. Man, I cannot catch a break. The water bottle just fell. But anywho. Yeah, so I got trolled. Wonderful. Terrific. All right, well, I'm just going to say the same thing I did on the last stream. The more that I watch or read this book, the more it makes me despise the Christian faith. Like, seriously. But, anywho, that's pretty much all. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Welcome to the stream. We are going to be finishing chapter 3 of Michael Parenti's History as Mystery. All right, so heck off, mosquito. So let's go ahead and get started. We have no idea how women clergy defended their right to address the religious community, since their writings were not deemed worthy of preservation by generations of male scribes. Some glimpses of their arguments survive in the works of male polemicists who repeat them only in order to refute them. Thus, we hear that some Montanist women clergy attributed a special grace to Eve because she was the first to eat of the tree of knowledge. They also note that the sister of Moses was a prophetess, and that Philip was an apostle, had 4 daughters who prophesied. Such contentions are known to us only because they are alluded to by Epiphanius, a 4th century defender of the church orthodoxy, who dismisses them as useless testimonies. Through much of the Christian Europe over the centuries, women were forbidden to make depositions in court or give testimony. They were forced into marriages not of their choosing, and they could be put away at a husband's caprice. During the Middle Ages, peasant women often suffered more under the burden of daily labor than men, especially among the lower peasant classes. For hundreds of years throughout Christendom, lasting well into the 18th century, tens of thousands of women were burned as witches. Women were sometimes burned at the stake for other transgressions, talking back to a priest, stealing, prostitution, masturbation, adultery, and bearing a child out of wedlock. Michelet offers some suggestive statistics on witch burning. 503 months in Geneva in 1513, 800 at Wurzburg, almost in one batch, and 1500 at Ballenberg. Both of these exceptionally tiny bishoprics. In Talleries, 400 souls were treated to the horrors of auto de la file on single occasion. Auto da file sounds like torture, but the members were even larger in Spain, where Jews and Moors were thrown in with witches. One judge in Lorraine, who burned 800 women, boasted that 16 of the accused had committed suicide, most likely to escape the impending torture and flames, which he took as certain evidence of their guilt. Nor was there much concern if the blameless were ensnared. As one medieval theologian explained, quote, "Why does God permit the death of the innocent? He does so justly. If they did not die by reason of the sins they have committed, yet they are guilty of death by reason of the Christian doctrine of original sin," unquote. Well into the 19th and 20th centuries, in most Christian nations, women were denied advanced education and could not vote. Catholic and Protestant clergymen were on the forefront of the fight against women's suffrage, arguing that female submission was ordained by God. Women could not serve on juries, obtain divorces, make wills, sign contracts, open bank accounts, or claim property rights against their husband, including the right to control the money they earned or inherited. Women who struggled for legalized abortion and contraception encountered vehement resistance, most persistently from Protestants, fundamentalists, and the Roman Catholic Church, as remains the case today. As late as 1931, a papal encyclical by Pius XI proclaimed that married life presupposed subjection and obedience of the wife to the husband. The encyclical reaffirmed one by Leo XIII from several decades earlier, which charged that female involvement in public affairs and other activities outside the home were likely to cause a woman to neglect her duties to husband and children and debase her womanly character. In 1977, the Vatican reaffirmed the traditional view that women could not be ordained in the priesthood, for it would violate, quote, the ministry willed by Lord Jesus Christ and carefully maintained by the apostles, unquote. And in the 1990s, Pope John Paul II held fast to the policy of excluding women from the clergy and denying them the right to artificial birth control and safe legal abortion. By the mid-20th century, after protracted debate, some mainstream Protestant denominations in the United States ordained female ministers and included women in their policy-making bodies. Whatever the long overdue gains made by women, the Christian ministries remained overwhelmingly male-dominated to this day. At the same time, women continue to do the most of the unpaid work in the churches. Ages ago, there were I'm sorry, I apologize. Ages ago, there were church dames, or can't pronounce that, as they were called in the 16th century France, who kept the chapel in good order. Today, we have church ladies who teach Sunday schools, organize the bazaars, cook the potluck dinners, do the mailings, raise the funds, and volunteer for charity work. Modern-day male theologians and historians continue to downplay the history of female clergy in early Christianity. Quote, when a woman's name in the early church is associated with a title, both Catholic and Protestant translators tend to minimize the office, unquote. Notes Karen Jo Torge. Wait, that wasn't a preacher. That was a historian. My bad. Quote, instead of translating diakonos as minister, as they do for male office holders, they arbitrarily translate to deaconess, a lesser rank. Louis Chotroff cites male theologians who decide their own that diaconia, when applied to females, is an office of charitable service, but when applied to males, it becomes the work done by missionaries like Paul. Chotroff finds numerous examples of much exegetical surgery performed by male theologians on early texts that contain no such differentiation. Today, German theologians seem to even more unflinchingly retrograde their American cohorts. Schotroff records how she was anathematized by her male colleagues in Germany when she put forth her anti-patriarchal classic egalitarian thesis on Christianity. When Torstein, herself a professor at Women's Studies and Religion and Claremont Graduate University, sent her German mentor, Eckhard Muhlenberg, a copy of her book, When Women Were Priests, he wrote back saying, quote, I'm afraid I cannot bring myself to read it, unquote. Likewise, when Karen King edited a book on feminine images and Gnosticism, which she gratefully sent her German mentor, Hans Martin Schneck, she discovered that the subject held no interest for him. He gave the book to his wife, thinking she might have some use for it. In ancient times, Levite patriarchs and then Christian clergy sought to stamp out the deeply rooted worship of female deities. Many of Paul's attacks on idolatry were directed against the goddess Artemis and Isis. The first Christian emperor, Constantine, suppressed the worship of Ashtaroth as immoral. In 380, Emperor Theodosius closed the temples of Elysius and Artemis. Quote, it was said that he despised the religion of women, unquote. The campaign to obliterate the female deity continues to this day in the realm of scholarship. The overwhelming prevalence of male archaeologists, historians, theologians, who are imbued with a patriarchal Judeo-Christian perspective, heavily influence what is emphasized and what is considered hardly worth mentioning. Although female god temples were unearthed in nearly every Neolithic and historic excavation, one male scholar simply echoes the Old Testament by writing that female deity was worshipped primarily on, quote, hills and knolls. A leading archaeological authority describes the female religion as, quote, orgiastic nature worship, sensuous nudity, and gross mythology, replaced by Israel's, quote, purity of life and, quote, lofty monotheism. Without benefits of evidence, various male scholars reduced the prehistoric female region with all its all-powerful female deities to nothing more than a fertility cult. Quote, but archaeological and mythological evidence of the veneration of the female deity as creator and lawmaker of the universe, prophetess, propheter, provider of human destinies, inventor, healer, hunter, and valiant leader in battle suggests that the title of fertility cult may be a gross oversimplification of a complex theological structure, unquote. Merlin Stone argues. While the pre-Judaic female religion is labeled a cult, a term that connotates something less fine than a religion, the primitive rituals and mythologies associated with the Judeo-Christian Yahweh and later the Christos Godhead are always respectfully described by these same scholars as, quote, religion, just as the word, quote, God, Lord, and even He are carefully endowed with capital letters, while the Queen of Heaven, Goddess, and She remain in lowercase. The female deity who is worshipped as creator of the universe is frequently referred to in most historical documents in the Near East as the, quote, Queen of Heaven. Some writers are willing to know her only as the, quote, Earth Mother. Once again, the available evidence is no match for the established ideology. Suppression of female worship of female deities was coordinated genocide against. Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. It always made more sense to me that if there was a god, that they would actually be female, because women tend to be the ones that bring life into the world. Men, as history has shown, are generally the ones that take it out. But anywho, the burning of books. An image likely to come to mind when thinking of the medieval church is of cloistered monks, the keepers of learning and literacy, toiling with quill pens to produce beautifully lettered manuscripts. Turgeon tells us that, quote, these monasteries were the bearers of the literary culture of Roman imperial Christianity, preserving the literary wealth of the Roman period, unquote. Harold Mattingly sees the church as, quote, a bulwark against insurgent barbarism during, quote, the dark centuries, unquote. Henry Lucas describes the medieval church as, quote, the repository of ancient culture, transmitting the literature and learning of antiquity, philosophy, theology, art, literature, and learning flourished under its protective wing. The reality is something else. Once the church gained official status under Constantine, there followed what Luciano Canfora describes as, quote, the melancholy experiences of the war waged by Christianity against the old culture and its sanctuaries, which meant against the libraries. The burning of the books was part of the advent of imposition, the advent and imposition of Christianity. Book burning began rather early as a Christian practice. As recorded in the New Testament, Christian converts in Ephesus respond to Paul's preaching. Oh, I'm sorry. Book burning began rather early as a Christian practice. As recording in the New Testament, Christian converts in Ephesus responded to Paul's preachings, quote, in the name of the Lord Jesus, unquote, by destroying a large store of books valued at 50,000 pieces of silver. Damn. After bestowing legitimate status upon Christianity, Constantine demanded the surrender of heretical works under penalty of death. In 435, Theodosius II and Valentinian III co-signed all heretical Nestorian books to the bonfire, and punishment was threatened for those who failed to deliver up Manichaean writings. Hold on. And punishment was threatened for those who failed to deliver up Manichaean writings for burning. One chronicler described a scene in the capital during Justinian's reign that has numerous parallels through the empire. Several pagan Greeks, quote, were arrested and taken forcibly from place to place, and their books were burned in the Kinian, and so were the images and statuses of their miserable gods. The Kinegian was the site where corpses of those condemned to death were flung. Damn. That seems to be the punishment for damn near everything back in those days. In 391, in Alexandria, a Christian throng, led by the bishop Theophilus, destroyed a major portion of antiquity greatest bibliotheca, the Seraphim, or the annex, or, quote, the daughter library to the main edifice, the latter known as the museum. The Serapeum, wherein was housed the pagan temple of Serapis, contained an irreplaceable trove of scrolls and codices dealing with history, natural science, and literature. Gibbon bemoans this destruction of the Library of Alexandria, quote, and near 20 years afterwards, the appearance of the empty shelves excited the regret and indignation of every spectator whose mind was not totally darkened by religious prejudice, unquote. Canphora debunks the widely held misapprehension that Julius Caesar himself, a greater supporter of libraries and learning, burned the Library of Alexandria, a myth given renewed currency by George Bernard Shaw's play Caesar and Cleopatra. The fire that occurred during Caesar's expedition in Alexandria was on the waterfront and nowhere near the library. Documentary evidence shows the library was still flourishing decades after Caesar's expedition to Egypt. In the years after the Serapeum was gutted, the Christians also purged the museum, the main library, so that by the time it was destroyed by the Islamic invaders of 641, it housed mostly patristic writings. Patristic writings. In pagan times, the Romans had libraries of up to 500,000 volumes, but with Christianity in command, the ancient Archimedes were closed, and in many dioceses, laymen were forbidden to even read the Bible. By the end of the 5th century, the profession of copyist had disappeared, as had the reproduction of most secular writings. The 6 largest monastic libraries in the 6th century contained collections numbering a paltry 200 to 600 volumes, mostly religious in context. The Greeks and Romans had produced a rich literature, but in Christendom, from AD 500 to AD 1100, hardly a book was written that currently wins our attention. Michelet describes the medieval church's scholastic schools as, quote, lighted by merest glimmer of a day through a tiny slit, unquote. For hundreds of years, quote, between Albarade and Occam, the progress made is nil, unquote. The great Greco-Roman tradition of secular learning and education was undone not only by the general decline of Roman civilization, but also by the ideological force of Christianity triumphant. While depicted as an oasis of learning amidst the brutish ignorance of the Dark Ages, the Church actually was a major purveyor of that ignorance. A regressive influence in such a field as literature, philosophy, art, theater, science, medicine, anatomy, astronomy, mathematics, and commerce. suppressing these subjects entirely or confining them to theological servitude. During the Dark Ages, there were few instances of book burning because there were few books left to burn. The revival of learning and inquiry that came from growing prosperity of the 11th and 12th centuries, labeled the High Middle Ages by some historians, also brought a revival of the church's bonfires. In 1210, the writings of suspected heretics at the University of Paris, along with the works by Aristotle, were torched. In 1229, the Council of Narbonne condemned the possession of any portion of the Holy Writs by laypersons. Works by Jamie I and Aragon and William of St. Amour were burned. The forbidden writings of the Albigensians and Waldensians were flung into the flames. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX attempted to cleanse Western Europe of Jewish books, especially the Talmud, which he and his associates incorrectly believed contained blasphemous allusions to the Savior and the Virgin. From the 13th to the early 15th centuries, in Paris, Aragon, Castelli, Tourlos, and other such places, wagon loads of the Talmud and other purportedly blasphemous Hebrew books were publicly burned. Up until the late 16th century or so, the church hierarchy viewed unbridled literacy among the masses as a threat to religious and social order. Secular learning was perceived as a gateway to heresy, but from the 17th century onward, with the growing dissemination of the printed word, the guiding policy of both Catholic and Protestant churches was not to attempt the impossible task of completely denying access to reading materials, but to control what texts were read and how they were interpreted. The Christian church of late antiquity and the Middle Ages also waged war against nature and the flesh, including concerned campaigns against bodily hygiene. The Roman Empire's great public baths were closed. Saints were saluted for having never washed. A naked display of one's body risked mortal sin. Personal ablutions were deemed a kind of defilement, not only in the cloister, but also among laypersons. Quote, never a bath known for 1,000 years, unquote, hoots the irrepressible Michelet. No wonder so many of the faithful were afflicted with boils, skin ulcers, and other dermatological torments. Upon becoming the official religion of the empire, the church waged war on thousands of beautiful edifices that served as pagan sites of worship. Quote, many of these temples were the most splendid and beautiful monuments of Grecian architecture, unquote, laments Gibbon. The emperor had an interest to maintain the splendor of his own cities and the value of his possessions. But as long as they stood, and regardless of what neutralized use they might be put to, such buildings remained lures for a possible pagan restoration. So, during the 380s, throughout the Roman world, quote, an army of Christian fanatics, without authority and without discipline, invaded peaceful pagan precincts and perpetrated, quote, the ruin of the fair structures of antiquity, unquote. The goal of the triumphant Jesus worshippers was to convert the whole world to Christianity, and the thrust was forward, outward, and global. This expansionist missionary zeal continues in modern times, contributing to the obliteration of historical memories and cultural heritage of indigenous peoples around the world. As Christianity expanded into distant lands, so did its suppressive mechanisms, including its time-honored practice of book burning. For example, in Mexico, in the early 16th century, church authorities, assisted by the swords of conquistadores, denounced all Aztec and Mayan hieroglyph books as the works of the devil, and systematically torched them, so depriving of invaluable sources of historical data on Mexico's early civilizations. In 1995, the bestseller by Thomas Cahill breathed new life into the myth of the church as a citadel of light and learning. Cahill portrays the monastic clergy as having, quote, saved classical civilization from those he calls, quote, unwashed barbarians who, quote, descended onto the Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books. While the barbarians certainly looted, Cahill offers not a scrap of evidence to support his repeated assertions that they burned books or waged, as the Christians long had been doing, a culture clap against lay literacy and learning. The, the barbarians seemed little interest one way or another in written texts. The one actual incident Cahill offers of book burning being damaged by invaders occurred centuries after the fall of Rome, in Ireland, when Viking terrorists, as he called them, looted some monasteries and, quote, destroyed the books by ripping off bejeweled covers for booty. Note, even in the instance their interest was the valuable gems. Note, even in this instance, their interest was the valuable gems, not in the destruction of the books themselves. Cahill offers the interesting theory that from the last days of the empire until what he calls, quote, the rise of medieval Europe, the less rigid and more literate Irish clergy rescued from extinction the classical and ancient folk literature, including Ireland's own rich contributions, and reintroduced works to Scotland, England, and the continents in the 17th and 18th centuries. Cahill's thesis is not of his own invention. Damn it, I lost my space. Sorry, guys. It's not his own invention. Oh, yeah, here we go. Historians have noted that Irish monastics produced an impressive flowering of classical learning. They not only preserved Greek and Latin literature, but relished them with truly literary enthusiasm. If the Irish thereby, quote, saved civilization, unquote, it was not from the barbarians, but from the fellow ecclesiastics on the continent. Actually, there were places in addition to the Irish monasteries in which literature and learning were preserved and even advanced. In the private manors by some few learned aristocrats, in the cities of the Byzantine Empire of southeastern Europe, among the Moors of northeastern Africa and Spain, and in other localities peripheral to Christendom. But Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, would have had far less sales and appeal had he more accurately entitled it, How the Irish Played a Limited but Valuable Role, along with others, in preserving a portion of what might be called civilization. Cahill offers not a word about the closing of academics, the destruction of libraries, the banning of books, and the overall intellectual repression waged by the Christian Church well before the fall of Rome and continuing long afterwards. From 320 to 395, 28 public libraries in Rome, quote, like tombs, were closed forever. As he quotes the lamenting Ammianus Marcinilius, who he fails to identify as a pagan and a noted 4th century historian. Again, the impression left is that the barbarians were to blame, but the closing occurred during the time of Christian domination, years before the barbarians sacked Rome in 410. Cahill does draw a few hints regarding Christianity's war against learning, mentioning Pope Gregory's hostility towards pagan classics and St. Jerome's fear of damnation for having rescued or read Cicero. Ironically, the actual case Cahill gives of book burnings by the Pope, Honorius III's order in 1225 to torch all copies of the metaphysical works of some originality by Irish philosopher John Scotus Erigena. Along with the closing of academics came the closing of minds. There was no limit to the enmity that leading churchmen felt towards secular arts and learning. The church fathers, quote, despised all knowledge that was not useful to salvation, along with every earthly and corporal delight, including the enjoyment of music, art, and literature. Early in the 3rd century, Tertullian relates how in the next life he would laugh and exult when he beheld the proud monarchs, sage philosophers, deluded scholars, celebrated poets, tragedians, dancers, and others, all groaning in the abyss and burning in the eternal flames. With equal vehemence, Augustine disdains the, quote, so-called liberal arts, unquote, that occupied his earlier years when he was, quote, a vile slave of vile affections, unquote. Secular learning was worse than superfluous. It was pernicious. He studied in rhetoric, logic, music, geometry, and arithmetic had led him not to God, but to his own perdition. But now, as a Christian, he felt like he could spend a lifetime studying only the scriptures, yet not fully plumb their rich mysteries. Before we blame the barbarians for destroying classical civilization, we might question whether the term, quote, civilization and, quote, barbarians convey an accurate impression of the respective cultural levels of contending forces in the 5th century. In the mind of the modern reader, quote, civilization, unquote, probably suggests a higher degree of social development and literacy than was actually enjoyed in 5th century Christendom. And, quote, the barbarians conjured up imagery of hairy brutes and animal skins. In fact, northern peoples had a level of civilization, had civil organization, folk culture, agriculture, and military technology that in many respects was the same or not much less advanced than what existed to the south. In the 1st century BC, long before the sacking of Rome, Gaul was, quote, more extensive in area, more populous, richer in resources, and only slightly less advanced technologically than Italy, unquote. Something of the same might be said of Germany. On various occasions during the early centuries of Christendom era, contingents of Germans and other northerners were allowed to settle within the empire and even join the Roman army. Quote, many of the German officers were men of brilliant talents, fascinating address, and noble bearing. Among another familiar but misleading image is of Rome being sacked and the empire being overturned by a horde of marauding barbarians. In 410, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, entered the city in an attempt to force the emperor to accept their demands for a homeland. Many Roman commoners, demoralized by the heavy taxes, corruption, and despotism of the late empire, were either indifferent to the invaders or actually welcomed them. Roman servants and slaves joined in the looting of wealthy residences and the killing of the ensued. Ha! Based. On orders of Alaric, the invaders did little damage to the churches, public buildings, and the city in general. After 6 days, the Visigoths departed. They may have sacked Rome, but they hardly brought down Roman civilization. Oh, so it was only the ruling class that got looted and destroyed, and that's why they painted it as like, oh, the whole of Rome got sacked, because it's only their history that matters, folks. Even with the subsequent takeover of Roman territory, the appearance of the Germanic tribes along much of the Mediterranean shore, as Henry Peary notes, the northern tribes throughout the settle themselves, quote, in happy regions where the mildness of the climate and the fertility of the soil were matched by the charms and the wealth of civilization. Their aim was not to disassemble the Roman Empire, quote, but to occupy and enjoy it, unquote. What they preserved far exceeded what they destroyed or introduced anew. To be sure, from the 6th to 10th century, successive invasions by the Slavs, Bulgars, and Magyars from the east, piratical Scandinavians from the north, and Saracens from the south had a seriously disruptive effect on Greco-Roman society and commerce. The point to remember, however, is that much of the civic impoverishment was effected before these invasions and must be credited to the narrowly spirited Christian orthodoxy that strove without stint for monopoly control over all cultural and intellectual output. While a Christianized Western and Central Europe slumped into the Dark Ages, there was no comparable de-evolution in the Byzantine Empire of Southeast Europe, and there was an extraordinary intellectual burgeoning throughout much of the Arabic world. In sum, contrary to the conventional wisdom, we should spend less time blaming the barbarians and more time scrutinizing the role played by Christianity in ushering in a stagnation that lasted for the better part of a millennium. I'm going to read a couple comments. You should have been taught this. Oh, you guys are just arguing. Got it. I'm not one to insult people's intelligence, but burgers make it so fucking hard. It's one thing to be ignorant about a subject, it's another to arrogantly pretend you know what you're talking about. Oh, that is a lot of people online. As it turns out, American culture and society is a wonderful breeding ground for levels of ignorant narcissism that you can't even possibly imagine. Anyways, next part. Preparing the Holocaust. Upon entering as the established religion early in the 4th century, the Christian Church launched and reinvigorated war against other beliefs, responding to the exhortations of their bishops and priests. Christian mobs destroyed pagan temples and sanctuaries, along with places of worship used by Jews, Donatists, Manichaeans, and other infidels and heretics, many of whom paid with their lives, most of whom had fared better under the pagan emperors than under the Christian successors. The treatments measured out to Jews composes an especially horrid record. Up until the early 5th century AD, official Roman policy recognized the right of Jews to practice their strange religion, as long as they lived peaceably with their Gentile neighbors and with each other. In AD 41, Emperor Claudius cautioned the Alexandrians, quote, to behave gently and kindly towards the Jews, and not to dishonor any of their customs in their worship of their God, unquote. Christian worship was generally unsuccessful in including the emperors to stop treating Judaism as a protected religion. Even decades after Constantine's edicts that led to Christianity's emergence as the official state-supported religion, Emperor Theodosius issued decrees pointing out that the Jewish sect was prohibited by no law, and that Jewish assemblies were not to be suppressed nor synagogues destroyed or despoiled. In time, the civic immunities that had been granted to the Jews were gradually remissen by Christian rulers. For a better part of 2,000 years, papal proclamations, church sermons, pastoral letters, hymns, council edicts, and the pronouncements of bishops and leading theologians heaped continually upon the Jews for their refusal to embrace Christianity and for the crucifixion of Jesus. If we rely on Scripture, which is all we have on this question, there seems to be no evidentiary grounds for blaming the Jews for the murder of Christ. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke clearly indicate that the Jewish multitude had nothing to do with the plot against Jesus. If anything, the populace enthusiastically endorsed the sermons he directed against a corrupt and privileged priestly class. Jesus' potentially seditious remarks caused the Pharisees and elders to conspire against him. But because of his popularity among Jewish commoners, they moved cautiously. Quote, and the scribes and chief priests sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were in admiration of his doctrine, and they sought to lay hold on him, but feared the people, unquote. The crowd that eventually called for Jesus' crucifixion composed but a minute and unrepresentative segment of the 2 million or so Jews in Palestine, most of whom probably never had any direct contact with the preacher from Galilee. The other 3 or 4 million Jews living in Antioch, Alexander, Rome, and elsewhere throughout the empire had little sense of what was happening in Jerusalem and most likely had never heard of Jesus. Scriptures aside, only a grotesquely racist blood theory of inheritable and collective guilt can blame Jesus' death on millions of Jews who had no part on the incident, and millions more born in the centuries that followed. Historically speaking, the crucifixion was the work of the Roman secular authorities who carried out the deed, egged on by the handful of upper-class Pharisees. The image of the Jews as Christ killers took shape in the 4th Gospel ascribed to St. John, the author of which, writing from a hostile perspective outside the Jewish world, tirelessly uses the phrase, quote, the Jews, where the earlier gospel talks of Pharisees, scribes, elders, and priests plotting against Jesus. The slander was repeated down through the ages, hardening into informal dogma. In 200, Oregon charged that Jews had committed most heinous crime of all, the murder of Christ, for which they suffered the destruction of their nation. At about that time, St. Clement served as Pope, ruled that Jews were to blame for Nero's persecution of Christians. A half a century later, St. Cyprian demanded the expulsion of all Jews from his Dioclese at point of the sword, if need be. More than a century later, St. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople and a leading church father, sermonized, quote, the Jews sacrifice of their children to Satan. They were worse than the wild. Hold on, I'm going to do this in the voice for entertainment value. Excuse me. The Jews sacrificed their children to Satan. They were worse than wild beasts, lower than the vilest animals. Their religion is a sickness. God always hated the Jews. It's incumbent upon all Christians to hate the Jews, unquote. The synagogue, he told his congregations, was, quote, worse than a brothel, unquote. It was, quote, a criminal assembly of Jews, a den of thieves, a house of ill fame, a dwelling of iniquity, the refuge of devils, unquote. The Jews, quote, know only one thing to satisfy their stomachs, to get drunk, to kill and to beat each other like the stage villains and coachmen, unquote. And Christians were strongly admonished never to associate with these, quote, lustful, rapacious, greedy, perfidious robbers, this nation of assassins and hanged men, unquote. The same Chrysostom is described by one Protestant divine as, quote, the most eloquent of preachers, unquote, who brought, quote, tidings of truth and love, unquote. And Cardinal Newman described Chrysostom as, quote, a bright, cheerful, and gentle soul, unquote, with an emotional temperament, quote, elevated, refined, transformed by the touch of heaven, unquote. In our day, sociologist Rodney Starks strives in that academic fashion to present himself as a neutral commentator by neutralizing his subject matter. Stark argues that we should not dismiss Chrysostom as, quote, a raving bigot, but see him as one among a number of ecclesiastical leaders who labored hard to separate the church from the synagogue in an age when the two were still closely intertwined. Chrysostom's attacks on Judaism, quote, reflect efforts to consolidate a diverse and splintered fact. There is no reason to assume that these two views of Chrysostom, Chrysostom, I cannot pronounce his name, are mutually exclusive. The bishop did indeed labor manually to consolidate his faith. He was a raving bigot. Consider the other saintly bishops of Saint Ambrosia, Archbishop of Milan, defended the burning of a synagogue by a Christian mob, telling Emperor Theodosius with deliberate defiance, quote, I hereby declare that it was I who set fire to the synagogue. Indeed, I gave the order for it to be done so that there should be no longer to be any place where Christ is denied. Saint Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, incited a Christian mob to expel the Jews from the city and seize their property. At about that time, Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, declared the fate of the Jews to be downtrodden and dispersed, and that, quote, the true image of Hebrew is Judas Iscariot, who sells the Lord for silver. The Jew can never understand the scriptures and forever will bear the guilt of the death of Jesus, unquote. Saint Jerome warned, quote, Jews are congenital liars. Jews are congenital liars who lure Christians to heresy. They should therefore be punished until they confess, unquote. All right. Jerome, Ambrosia, Augustine, and others were not obscure friars. They were leading doctors of theology and influential churchmen whose writings had a widespread and lasting impact. They bestowed lasting impact. They bestowed a respectability on anti-Semitic preachments that continued through the Middle Ages and into modern times. In the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas considered it lawful and to describe, according to custom, to hold Jews because of their crime in perpetual servitude, unquote. Oh, so enslave the Jews. Several centuries later, Martin Luther, convinced that his modified version of Christianity would be readily accepted by the Jews, was furious to discover otherwise. It was their malevolent obstinacy that made them reluctant to convert. He concluded, and not many deficiencies in his doctrine or practice. So he attacked the Jews with the full measure of his hatred, urging that their synagogues and homes be destroyed and they be driven out the contrary, quote, verily a hopeless, wicked, venomous, and devilish thing of the existence of these Jews are pests, torments, and misfortune, unquote. Eric Myers reports a wealth of archaeological findings in Italy and near Galilee of closely related communities of Jews and Christians living harmoniously together. A condition that did not survive Christianity's emergence as the triumphant religion in the 4th century. In Spain and other parts of the Western Europe, during the Dark Ages, AD 500 to AD 1000, a stream of decrees from the church and state officials ordering the populace and lower clergy to refrain from friendly relations with Jews. This suggests that the people had paid little heed to such directives, preferring to continue their everyday social intercourse with Jews, failing to perceive them as demonic or dangerous, as Joshua Trachtenberg comments. Quote, the constant reiterated fulminations of church authorities against close social and religious intercourse between the two groups. Quote, it comes to such a pass that uneducated Christians say that Jews preached better to them than our priests, unquote. Complained Agobard against eating and drinking and living with Jews. Testify to their unimpaired and cordial intimacy. Even the clergy had to be forbidden from time to time to be friendly with Jews. Christians took service in Jewish homes as nurses and domestics, and Jewish traders dealt in ecclesiastical articles. Business relations were markedly free and close, and there are many instances of commercial partnership between adherents of the two faiths. The Jews of Christian legend, the Christ killer who rejected and was rejected by God, the devil incarnate who allegedly indulged in secret poisonings, blood rites, anti-Christian sorcery, ritual murder of Christian children, desecration of the sacred host, and other abominations, such a creature bore little relationship to the real Jew whom the common people knew. The demonized Jew, quote, was entirely the creation of theological thinking, and exotic plants that did not speedily take root in the newly converted lands. The European peasant had to learn, and he learned slowly, that he was expected to equate the theological Jew with the neighbor whose friendship he enjoyed and whom, sorry, getting harassed by bugs. And I lost my spot. Great. Here we go. The demonized Jew, quote, was entirely a creation of theological. Read that. The European peasant had to learn, and he learned slowly, that he was expected to equate the theological Jew with the neighbor whose friendship he enjoyed, with whom he worked and dealt. Anti-Semitism usually ascribed to popular prejudice and a more or less spontaneous mass hysteria. In fact, anti-Semitic campaigns, like others such political, racial, and religious witch hunts, are frequently initiated and engineered from on high. Much of the potential life involves the rational manipulation of irrational sentiments by ruling elites. During the early centuries of Christianity, anti Semitism was primarily the hyped product of ecclesiastical and secular leaders whose interest was to secure their hold over the populace. The problem was that the mass of their hold, the problem is that the mass of people did not share their preoccupation with heretics and infidels, nor did the peasantry have any great interest in Christianity itself, retaining for centuries a sub rosa attachment to magic, sorcery, and ancient pre Christian practices. If they needed centuries of prodding to become full blown anti Semites, perhaps it was partly because they were such lukewarm Christians from the start. The official proscribed Jews served as a convenient scapegoat, blamed for famines, plagues, pestilence, village, material wants, and other supposed manifestations of divine displeasure. Anti Semitism helped distract the populace from their real grievances about land, taxes, and tithes. Better the people stormed the synagogue than wreaked their fury upon the manor, the monastery, and the cathedral, inhabited as these latter were their fellow Christians, who also happened to be their real oppressors. Throughout the Middle Ages and into later times, Jews were afflicted with a galmotes of legal and societal disabilities that diminished their social status and stigmatized them in the eyes of Christians. They were subjected to forced conversion, periodic confinement, expulsion, special taxes, extortions, ghettoization, confiscation of property, bans on their religious observances, and the burning of their synagogues. Jews were banned from public office in most professions. They were forbidden to own farmlands or engage in exports and import business. In various localities, authorities prohibited marriage and all other social contact between Christians and Jews. And there were occasions when Jewish children were forcibly removed from their families and handed over to Christian households or monasteries. What business monasteries had with children is not explained. In 1215, the initiative of Pope Innocent III, the Fourth Lateran Council, adopted a series of measures to degrade and impoverish the Jewish population of Europe. Trade boycotts, social ostracism, expulsion from all positions of authority and trust, and the wearing of a distinctive badge that visibly branded Jews as a race of outcasts. Not all classes were eager to inflict such injuries upon the Jews, noted Malcolm Hay. Quote, hatred was the product of clerical propaganda, unquote. During the Middle Ages, in countries like Spain, quote, no social class except the clergy showed any inclination to attack the Jews, who, owing to their intelligence and their industry, were contributing to the prosperity of the country. But Jewish prosperity anywhere was regarded by the papacy as contrary to holy rites and a menace to Christendom, unquote. A church leader made it clear in repeated pronouncements the infidel Jews should be allowed to live, but only in a state of misery under Christian yoke, so that they might bear witness to true faith which they stubbornly abjured. Quote, their own sin consigned them to eternal slavery, unquote, wrote Pope Gregory to his bishops in 1230. Oh my God. I fucking hate Christianity so goddamn much. Anyways, by the early medieval period, church efforts at setting Christians against Jews was having the desired effect. Even then, the anti-Semitism of common folk was, quote, supported by the official policy of the church, actively propagated by all of its legislative enactments of secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The mob that attacked and despoiled the Jews reduced them to desperate levels of impoverishment, were often led by nobles and high clergy who saw opportunities for stealing property or invading repayment of the debt of Jewish creditors. One notable exception to a millennium of Jew-hating popes and bishops was Innocent the Fourth, who in the mid-13th century vigorously and repeatedly called for humane treatment of Jews, and who urged secular authorities to defend Jewish communities from Christian avarice. His proclamations, quote, will surprise readers who have been brought up on history books. in which Jews never appeared except as greedy usurers, unquote. Speaking of which, Christian users were far worse than Jewish counterparts, who tended to lend at lower rates. Numerous observations from Geoffrey of Paris, a medieval chronicler, to Thomas Witherby, an early 19th century Englishman, offer similarly testimony regarding the willingness of the Jewish leader to incur greater risk for more reasonable rates. Even Bishop Grotestese, no friend of the Jews, advised the faithful to patronize the more reasonable Jewish moneylenders and shun the Christian users because they were, quote, all without mercy. Oh, great. So more projection, more fucking projection. Great. Oh my God. Ugh. Sorry, guys, I need water. Some of the unscrupulously rapacious Christian moneylenders were financed by bishops and princes who shared in the profits. If anyone was obsessively engaged in the pursuit of money, it was the wealthy ecclesiastic and secular leaders of Christendom, who in this regard differed little from most other ruling classes in history. The authorities who engaged in mass expulsions of Jews from England, France, Germany, and Spain from the late 13th to late 15th centuries may have been propelled by a desire to preserve the, quote, Christian purity of their lands, but another more substantial motive was cupidity. Jewish property, homes, gold, silver, and precious stones were confiscated. As Malcolm Hay notes, the bishops and princes who attacked Jewish communities, quote, were all animated by the same profit-making motive, unquote. Whatever the defamatory charges leveled by Jews, quote, the result was always the same. Jewish money went into the pockets of the hunters, unquote. Jews who had any money or property were hunted to death. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, often at the urging of the popes, bishops, priests, and nobility. Major massacres occurred in Germany, one of the worst in 1196, where there were massacres in England in 1290 and in various European cities during the Black Death epidemic of 1347 to 1350. The next 2 centuries saw massacres in Hungary, Spain, and Ukraine. In 1451, John of Capistrano led the Inquisition against Jews in Northern Europe in an orgy of criminal bloodletting that did not prevent his being canonized as a holy saint and defender of the faith. During the Crusades, at the urging of church leaders, Christian troops deemed it their duty to massacre Jewish populations as a prelude to their campaigns against infidelity in the Holy Land. There were instances during the Middle Ages that when church and state authorities issued condemnations of anti-Semitic outrages and excuse me, one more time. There were instances during the Middle Ages when church and state authorities issued condemnations of anti-Semitic outrages and mob passions, but never was there a denunciation of theological ill will that incubated such violence. And the mildness of papal letters deploring the brutal and mistreatment of Jews stands in striking contrast to the vehemence and venom expressed by the church hierarchy when denouncing Jews. Yeah, whatever. Let's start here. By the 14th and 15th centuries, a conversion to Christianity was no longer a way to escape persecution. A prime target of the Spanish Inquisition were Jews who had converted but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Thousands of conversos were burned at the stake. Thus, Jewish blood taint continued to be treated by church inquisitors as a containment irrespective of religious subscription, laying the ground for racist anti-Semitism and Nazism. In Russia and Eastern Europe in the mid-17th century, the killing of Jews were accompanied by dreadful tortures. Victims had their hands and feet amputated, were split asunder, flayed alive, roasted on coals, burned at the stake, or boiled alive in scalding hot water. From the 19th century onward, Jews gained emancipation in Christian countries throughout Europe, yet continued to confront serious discrimination. In 1800, in the United States, Jews were barred from holding state and local public office by provisions in the most state constitutions and required officials to believe in the divinity of Jesus. In Germany, Russia, Romania, and elsewhere, Jews continued to suffer limitations on where they could live and were barred from certain trades, professions, and government posts. Whole communities of Jews were subjected to forced conversion or deranciniation. Uh, in Russia, the Tsarist government fingered the Jews as exploiters of the peasants. Throughout the 19th century, at least until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, peasants launched pogroms against hundreds of Jewish settlements while police took the other way. Towards the end of the 19th century, Pope Pius IX unsuccessfully opposed an Italian law that granted Jews equal rights in Italy, and to divert the public attention from anti-clerical attacks to this day, Pius issued a great series of anti-Jewish pronunciation, yeah, pro, pro, pronuncia, whatever. Meanwhile, the Catholic publications throughout Europe launched Jew baiting attacks. Political conservatives found anti-Semitic political organizations and publications in Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, and elsewhere. Former Jesuit theologian Peter de Rosa noted that while the Roman Church published over 100 official anti-Semitic documents throughout the centuries, quote, not one conciliar decree, not one papal encyclical bull or pastoral directive suggests that Jesus' command, love your neighbor as yourself, unquote, applied to Jews, unquote. Not until 1959, on orders of Pope John the 23rd, described by Encyclopedia Judacia as, quote, the first pope to show high personal regard for Jews and Judaism, unquote, were anti-Semitic passages expunged from the Good Friday prayer, including reference to the perfidious Jews. And it was not until the Second Vatican Council in 1965 that church leaders formally condemned anti-Semitism and repudiated the notion of Jewish guilt for the crucifixion of Jesus. Seen in this historical context, the Holocaust is not the mysterious enormity. I'm sorry, one more time. Seen in this historical context, the Holocaust is not the mysterious enormity it is sometimes made out to be. To ask incredulously, quote, how could such a thing have happened, unquote, is to overlook the fact that Jewish people had been maligned, persecuted, and massacred for almost 2,000 years. When the Nazis came along, their venomous message fell on the ground, long fertilized by Christianity's age-old war against the Jews. Pierre Vasson concludes that, quote, Hitler neither could nor would have done to the Jewish people what he has done if we had not actively paved the way for him by our own unfriendly attitude towards the Jews, by our selfishness, and by the anti-Semitic teachings in our churches and schools, unquote. Others such as Trachtenberg, Kahn, Schatroff, Grosser, and Hopbrand agree that, quote, by underlying spirit of the Holocaust, it's almost 2,000 years old. Hannah Arendt sharply disputes that view, claiming that modern anti-Semitism is a uniquely contemporary phenomenon, a chasm that separates the modern world from both antiquity and the Middle Ages with respect to Jewish affairs. Furthermore, she argues, modern anti-Semitism is racial in form with no roots in Christianity and is itself anti-Christian. Here, Arendt must be thinking of the anti-Christian strain of Nazism and in some of the atavistic German Volkskults. Ardent's view is open to serious challenge, to posit a sharp discontinuity between the modern world and earlier ages, as she does, quote, runs against common sense and sound historiography, argues John Gagger. There are no fixed or distinct periods in history other than those perlocated in the minds of historians, who out of necessity must impose some organization upon time and social experience. Certainly, The New Testament has made the transition from antiquity to the modern age. And in regard to Christian anti Semitism, portions of the New Testament provided the first seeds. There are passages in the fourth gospel and elsewhere that fuel the myth of Jesus as Christ killers. Ardent notwithstanding the images of Jesus as the course of economical disasters, the Jews as carriers of blood taint, as bestial, diabolic, avaricious, treacherous, murderously preying upon Gentile community, and deserving of perpetual suffering and even extermination, such cruel caricatures propagated by popes, bishops, and saints over the centuries can also be found mutanus mutandis in Nazi propaganda. Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels made clear his debt to Christian demonology when he exclaimed, quote, "Such is their wickedness that no one should be surprised to see a Jew as the personification of the devil among our people, representing everything that is evil," unquote. To be sure, not all Nazis' anti-Semitic caricatures were appropriated directly from Christian sources. Some came via 19th century rightist political organizations and other secular propagandists. But these latter images, in turn, had a theological source. A study by Uriel Tal shows the impact in Germany during the Second Reich of two anti-Semitisms, one Christian propagated widely by pastors and theologians, and other explicitly anti-Christian. The latter victory had borrowed heavily from Christian sources. For instance, the expression, quote, "the Jews are our misfortune," unquote, adopted as a slogan by the leaders of the Christian Socialist Party in Germany in the 19th century, later became a popular Nazi motto. While erroneously ascribed to the nationalist ideologue Trech, Tretzky, it actually comes from Luther. Most significant than words were Christianity's terrible practices: ghettoization, forced denunciation, denying legal and economic rights, expropriating property, defiling synagogues, looting and destroying Judas' homes and businesses, burning sacred and secular Jewish literature, forcing the wearing of badges of dishonor, humiliating assaults, unspeakable torture, hold on, looting, unspeakable torture. I'm so sorry, guys. I am getting burned out. And repeated massacres. All were part of Christianity's war against the Jews centuries before the Nazis put these same practices into more systematic operations from 1933 to 45, exterminating 6 million Jews in what became known as the Holocaust. Nazi anti-Semitism served as a scapegoating function similar to the old Christian Jew baiting. Hitler's propagandists blamed the Jews for just about all existing social ills in an effort to direct popular grievances away from giant cartels that were the major authors of economic injustice and hard times. The Vatican itself belatedly seems to have recognized a link between traditional Christian anti-Semitism and Nazis' variety. In 1998, it issued a formal statement denouncing crimes against Jews perpetrated over the centuries and deploring the generally dismal record of Christian nations in assisting the Jewish people during Nazi oppression. While praiseworthy for the sentiments expressed, the Vatican statement can also be criticized for what is left unsaid. Anti-Semitism is solely as an attitude entertained by undifferentiated population of Christians, a product of something vaguely described as Christian civilization. Relations between Jews and Christians are equivocally described as tormented and negative in what amounts to a false balancing act. What is missing is any reference to the crucial role played by the church itself. The centuries of calumny and atrocity against a law-abiding minority of popes, bishops, saints, monks, church-inspired mobs, and inquisitors. Also admitted from the Vatican statements is any mention of the collaboration between prominent members of the church hierarchy and the Nazis before and during and after World War II. Although the persecution of Jews throughout Christendom continued for the better part of 2 millennia, It often goes unmentioned in the textbooks on European history, except for reference in the Nazi Holocaust. The great contributions of the Jewish people to science, medicine, art, literature, commerce, and politics are seldom mentioned, although there sometimes is a reference to how the Jews were forced to become usurers, with nothing said of Christian usury. In sum, contrary to popular notions, from early in its history, Christianity supported secular and ecclesiastical autocracy, class oppression, slavery, sexism, and anti-Semitism. For centuries, it had a severely regressive effect upon about every area of learning. In addition, the church officials tortured and executed tens of thousands of witches and exterminated whole populations of heretics, infidels, and Jews. Far from being a purveyor of human rights, Christianity has more often been an antagonist. Most of the struggles for class justice, emancipation, gender equality, religious tolerance, and other rights have been waged by secular, not religious groups. In fact, seldom acknowledged in our classrooms. In recent decades, those with Roman Catholic Church who have been struggling for human rights and social justice have been repeatedly repressed by the Vatican under the aegis of Pope John Paul II. In the late 1970s, the Vatican threw its weight around against the liberation theology movement. John Paul II packed the College of Cardinals with conservatives. In Latin America, he appointed a large number of conservative bishops to impoverished urban dioceses, transferring liberal ones to remote rural areas. He suppressed liberation theology curricula in seminaries and imposed Vatican manuals, silenced liberation theology theories, and forbade liberal and radical clergy from holding public office. The prelates were to administrators to souls and to avoid engage in political struggles. Meanwhile, John Paul II, the most political of all popes, actively supported the political involvement of his more conservative clergy, the laity who operated in a quasi-fascist organization, Opus Dei. The Pope himself continually intervened in world affairs, remaining up to his ears in counter-revolutionary politics, even entering into a clandestine alliance with President Reagan in an attempt to hasten the dissolution of communism in Eastern Europe. In the average school, instructors who raise serious questions about the theory of practice and practice of Christianity run the risk of encountering uncomfortable pressures from parents, clergy, and superiors. Those who engage in a critical research of Christianity's history face certain hurdles, as Agar puts it. For the most part, the task of dismantling the orthodox version of the past consists of laborious deconstruction and intelligent guesswork. Frustration is a constant companion. The problem is not merely that the sources for the other voices are missing. Such sources, after all, belong to the spoils of victory and frequently have been consumed by in the celebratory bonfires. An even more persistent frustration lies in the difficulty of altering our habitual ways of thinking. Without knowing it, we perceive the past according to paradigms first created many centuries ago. Let me repeat that. Without knowing it, we perceive the past according to paradigms first created many centuries ago. Today, one would have to search long and hard to find any critical discussion of the darker side of Christian history in the major media, history school books, or in mainstream publications and other avenues of public discourse. History has been kind to the Christians, even the worst of them, because the Christians have written so much of it, and because of the varieties of organized Christianity persist as highly coercive forces in Western society. And that's the end of the chapter. But before we close, I do have a couple comments. Damn, that's a lot of citations. Damn, that's a lot of citations. 158 citations in this chapter alone. I'm going to go ahead and pull the page, and so little after class discussion. You guys got any questions, comments, anything you want to say? So next time I hear some dipshit Nazi on the internet talking about how the Jews have been expelled from all these civilizations and this and that. He's like, oh, it must, that means, oh, my bad. It must be the Jews' fault. It's obviously the Jews' fault because they got expelled. Or maybe, just maybe, the church has been maliciously repressing and suppressing the fuck out of them and like using them as scapegoats for all of the flaws, failures, and shortcomings of their own social systems that they perpetuate on their own. And it took literal centuries of indoctrination to convince the masses of people that the Jews were their enemy. I'll tell you what, man. I'm probably going to start doing polemics against Christianity. I'm not going to lie. I need to broaden my horizon. I'm going to continue to do polemics against capitalism, but I feel like there's other things, like, at least from a superstructural standpoint, that are worth attacking that prop up and reproduce capitalism or reproduce society as we know it that need to be attacked. So attacking capitalism is key. We must keep doing that. But I feel like on top of that, we got to start doing polemics against other institutions within the superstructure that help reproduce the economic base. You know, I didn't start making a hard left turn in my politics until I became an atheist and I lost all faith. That's pretty much when my politics became more and more left wing year after year after year. Now, granted, it still took me like 7 years to get to where I am now, or only begin to. But still, I feel like not being, renouncing my faith and becoming an atheist is probably when I finally started to actually appreciate life and see things from a more open perspective. But anyways, what do you think of Christian socialism? Like Norman Thomas, who was the Socialist Party of America candidate during the 30s. Well, I understand you can't just abolish Christianity outright. So, you know, though I have issues with the institution of Christianity itself, I'm not opposed to Christian socialism if you want to like take the original preachings of Jesus, you want to cherry pick pretty much all of Jesus' like best passages, like when he says that you basically can't go to heaven if you're rich, then I personally think, yeah, run with it. I actually think that's good because I think religion's going to wither and it's going to change shape as time goes on, but I feel like, to fill the void, Christian socialism could be a useful tool. So, I mean, sure, why not go for it if you feel like you can radicalize people? Problem is that to be a Christian socialist, you are going to be facing an ungodly amount of opposition in the church because I don't know how many of you guys attended church, but there is a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of thought policing that goes on in environments like that. So, for you Christian socialists, you have your work cut out for you. Evo Morales is a Catholic. Do you see? Wait. Do you know? Did you know that Karl Kautsky wrote a whole book saying that Jesus was actually a proto-socialist? No, I did not. But no, like a lot of Jesus's quotes are actually very socialistic. Like, in fact, the very earliest roots of Christianity before it got appropriated into the Roman Empire, like its original roots, if you go back far enough, actually is like to the commune, like the early Christian communes that date back thousands of years ago, like the agrarian Christian communism that goes back forever and ever ago. Like there was a commons, there was like common ownership, and there were like actual like values, like actual like socialist Christian values. Like you can, you know, derive socialist values out from some Christian passages in literature. Um, yeah, nah, I didn't. Doesn't surprise me. What's the name of the book? Controlling religion is much better than trying to remove it. Uh, I mean, if you want to rework it, just cherry pick the parts that you like and use that to argue for socialism, that's fine. Because reactionaries constantly cherry pick the parts of the Bible that they use to argue for their backwards, stupid ideas, their regressive, shitty ideas, so they can support their, arguments. All in all, I don't think religion should be banned. I'm not an advocate of state atheism. I'm very much in favor of a secular government, but I do think that heavy-handed religious repression will be necessary, at least during and a solid decade after the revolution, because there really hasn't been like one movement for progress or reform or revolution or really just taking humanity in a slightly more positive direction that hasn't been like relentlessly and ruthlessly frustrated by the church and the men of the cloth. So, yeah, take of that as you will. What are my thoughts on Buddhism compared to Christianity? Well, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the history, but I'm pretty sure Buddhists are guilty of a lot of barbarism as well. Like the Buddhist temples out in like East Asia, out in Asia, they were basically these feudal monarchies, or yeah, basically these feudal regimes where the temples would basically like think of it like this. What does that say about your religion where you've got these gigantic mega-sized temples that are filled with all these dowries, all this gold, all these valuable plates and jewelry on one hand, and then it's just surrounded by these pauperous villages and tents and like run down shanty towns on the other hand. Like, what does that tell you about the values of the men of the cloth and the people that are in charge? So that has oftentimes been the case with Buddhism. So I don't really have that much of a better view of Buddhism. I mean, I think it's a lot less cringe. I like Buddhism because of the self improvement and self actualization standpoint of it. I just don't really like the personal restrictions that you have to impose on yourself. That I just think you're pointlessly diminishing your quality of life. But just you know, believing in God or believing in a religion to me is a lot like picking a class in an RPG and building a character in an RPG. You pick your stats, your advantages, your drawbacks, and you just run with it and you have a little fun. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's the reason why I know about that. Like, I actually read the article about, uh, like Tibet, like exactly what Parenti was talking about. Bringing back the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, I don't necessarily think it was a bad thing. I mean, honestly, you can't really ban religion. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any comment on it. I don't think it's a bad thing or a good thing. Um, let's see. The synthetic left thinks that Tibet was heaven on earth before the Chinese invaded, but the actual fact, well, yeah, no, they were a feudalist shithole. Yeah, no, I completely get that. Like, they don't realize, like, Tibet was incredibly reactionary. Honestly, nah, I'm in favor of smashing feudalism, like the last remnants of feudalism. Nah, I don't care. Um, like feudal economic relations and the superstructures that reproduce it actively hold us back as a species. Thousands of years of stagnation when the Christians took to Rome and ran their bullshit for as long as they did. I mean, hell, man, if I had the gauntlet, the Thanos gauntlet, and if I could snap my fingers, I would make I would make what all the major popes in early Christian Rome just disappear, save humanity, thousands of years of stagnation caused by the gap in the Christian Dark Ages. Nah, I'm just kidding. Didn't the Tibetan government ask to be annexed because British? I honestly need to reread that article. The CIA funded an anti-communist insurgency. Bro, read us some Hegel. Uh, so what I really ought to do is pull out a pack of cigarettes and start smoking them and burning and taking the burning cigarette and poking holes in my forearm live on camera. Because to ask me to read Hegel, you may as well be asking me to do something as painful as burning my forearm with lit cigarettes. But yeah, sure, I'll read some Hegel sometime. Anyways, that's all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed the live reading. This has been very fun. And I will see you guys next time.